With our layout for the magazine, we aim to fit the codes and conventions of larger magazine companies such as Empire or Total Film Mag as much as possible, as even though they don't typically display horror films on their front covers and normally go for big blockbuster hits, we'd rather have a more professional looking magazine cover than something a horror magazine company such as Fangoria would produce. So when it came to following these codes and conventions, we placed our main killer in the center of the page so that he again would be the center of attention, just like Empire has done with this magazine, as it helps us to continue branding our product as well as fitting all the codes and conventions that we need to. And then with the text, we just analysed a couple of posters that obviously Total Film Mag and other big brand, big media companies would produce, like their magazines. And what we did was we analysed them and then looked where the text would typically be placed, like you'd have your title at the bottom and your masthead at the top, because this is also an iconic brand that the audience of the magazine will look for, as well as then the typical stories, like where they would be placed on the magazine, and they were typically centered around the image. So that's what we tried to pull off ourselves here with our magazine. With our fonts and the sizes of text, we had to continue to follow these codes and conventions Empire and Total Mag set. To do this, we picked up a blocky font like Empire has for its own for our masthead, which we then placed at the top in the biggest size out of all of the text on the page. This is because obviously the audience are going to be looking for this magazine. Like the audience looking for the magazine, they're going to not really want to get confused, because if they see a massive title that says obviously Trapped, they think, oh, it's a magazine Trapped, when obviously it's not. The magazine is Aspect, and we need to make sure that we're also branding, not just branding the film, but branding the magazine. And companies such as Empire and Total Film Mag always have their title at the top, like their masthead always at the top, in the largest font on the page. So this is something we were then going to take forward and do as well. Also, with the text, like the text, our Traps title, what we had to do is we had to keep it also with the same font, because we had to follow this branding and keep it so it was continuous, like throughout all of our products. And then with other text, like the stories, we picked up this new style of font that we just got. Basically, the reasoning for this was we didn't want it to be associated with the masthead or the film title, otherwise this would confuse the audience. So we just got a new font, different size. It's obviously a lot smaller because they are not as important, but it's something we want our audience to be aware of when they're reading the magazine, and this is something Empire magazine also does. So it also then fit in codes and conventions. We also had to change the colour of the text for each story, so the audience would realise that each story is separate from one another, instead of just reading it all down in white and thinking that's all one big story, whereas we go white, red, or red, white, so they can realise that these are separate stories and it's not all one thing. With our use of language, there was a lot more to think about with the magazine compared to the poster, because there was a lot more text to be included that the audience would then be reading. We had the title and the masthead, but then again, just like with the poster, these are not changeable, so the main focus of the language was within the stories we had placed. So when it came down to the language we used with these stories, we looked into other magazines and their use of language, and we found a lot of them tried to relate the language towards the genre of the film or what imagery had been used. So we just went ahead with nail-biting tension, which we believed fit towards the horror genre. We also had to think about this use of language again with the stories we placed, but Empire magazine and Total Mag didn't use much and kept it short and snappy, so this is a convention we tried to provide for our own cover. So here we had text like interview of the directors, which is short and snappy just to inform the reader, which we thought is the best way of going about it. With the integrating of our imagery with the text in our magazine, we tried to follow the codes and conventions as much as possible by having our imagery of the killer bleed over the masthead, which is done in nearly all of Empire magazines, as shown here. Then, with the film title, we placed it on top of the imagery, as this is another coding convention that we had to follow to keep a professional look to our magazine. Other than this, the only other text that we had to integrate was the stories, which only surrounded the imagery, as they were not as important as the main film that's issued on the cover, and we wouldn't want the audience to think that there are any connections between the stories and the imagery unless there actually was. When it came down to the framing of our shot for this magazine cover, surprisingly a lot more time and work went into it than it did the poster, and that's generally down to the fact that we wanted to get this angle that made the killer look really, really dominant through the use of a close-up, and it took a long time and took a lot of shots to try and get this the correct way we actually wanted to get it. But when we did, obviously it then paid off. It also took a bit longer because we had to play around with the lighting a bit more, trying to get it on the mask so it wasn't too gleaming, but it stood out enough so it could be seen because we were in a pitch black room, obviously because we wanted to get that really nice effect with the background so he stands out really well. With our shooting material, we did not need to take much with us, just like we didn't with the poster. Then with the mise-en-scène, we had to make sure we kept the machete yet again, as well as the masks, to make sure they were on display within this magazine that we were creating, because we had to keep this brand going, just like we did when we did the poster and we did the film trailer. Like, this brand has to be continuous. So yeah, again, we did it here with the magazine. Then there was the lighting again, which this time we spent a lot more time placing the lighting in different areas and at different angles so we could try and make sure the killer was visible but the mask wasn't gleaming so it didn't look too fake. And the final thing when it came to the shooting material was what he wore. And again, we dressed up the killer in black, basically just to connect this danger and death to continue making him look as dominant as possible within the magazine cover. When it came to the manipulation of our photography, there was a lot less to do with the magazine cover compared to the poster. And all we really did was use the eraser tool to remove distractions and then fill them in with the clone tool to copy over certain sections. Other than this, the only real things we did was slightly adjust the contrast on the mask to give it a better effect than we already had, and place the text into the correct places. And finally, the last thing we actually did was, unlike the poster where the smashed glass has the transparency and it's placed behind the text, we placed it behind the killer with the magazine so it sort of looks like it's fading in that way instead, which is something slightly different to what we did on the poster.